The European Parliament has approved changes to its migration policy, allowing countries to set up return hubs outside the bloc. The new EU law is aimed at speeding up the deportation of migrants who have no legal right to stay in a member state. But it still requires formal approval from the 27 member governments. For more on this, we are joined by Olivia Sundberg Diez, who is an EU advocate on migration and asylum at Amnesty International. Olivia, good to have you with us and appreciate your time. Firstly, the biggest aspect of this overhaul of the EU migration policy are these return hubs to deport migrants who presumably overstayed their visas. What's your understanding of how these return hubs are supposed to work, and where might these be situated?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Indeed, there's a lot that we still don't know about this very contentious element of the return regulation that is making its way through EU institutions at the moment. One of the most concerning elements of this proposal is indeed that it creates a highly contentious legal framework for return hubs or offshore deportation centers in countries outside of the EU, requiring only that there is an agreement or even an informal arrangement with those countries, which means that people may be sent to countries to which they have no link whatsoever, countries that they may have never set foot in, that they may have never even heard of before, either to face detention indefinitely perhaps, or onward deportations to their countries of origin. This is something that we know some governments are very keen to implement as soon as possible. And there's discussions with countries such as Uganda, Rwanda, Uzbekistan, Mauritania, Senegal, and others to try to reach these kinds of agreements already in the next year. There's a lot we don't know, and the regulation itself is very vague as to what these agreements need to contain. But from Amnesty International, we do not believe that these return hubs can be implemented in a human rights compliant manner. By their very design, they carry a risk of arbitrary detention in third countries, which would be automatic and therefore unlawful. They carry a risk of refoulement, or people being sent onwards to persecution in their country of origin. They carry a risk of inhuman and degrading treatment, perhaps even of enforced disappearances in those countries, protracted situations of limbo and uncertainty for people in third countries. And of course, we can foresee huge challenges when it comes to monitoring conditions, making sure people have access to legal aid and assistance, determining which countries are responsible for any human rights violations that may result. So our position has been that they should be rejected in their entirety.
Which groups of migrants do you think this would impact more than others? You know, which source countries do these migrants who, are supposedly not allowed to be in the EU from?
Well, one thing we need to remember is that these policies affect a very large number of people. Very often at EU level, we talk about people who have had their asylum claims rejected, people that came seeking protection and have been denied that for whatever reason. New EU rules make it a lot easier to reject asylum applications without a full assessment on the merits, simply deciding that there's a third country somewhere that is willing to take that person. So really, the group of people that could be subject to this will grow significantly based on new EU asylum rules. They also include people that may have been overstaying their visas, people that may not even have known that their visas have expired. So it's really a very large group of people affected. At the moment, one thing we know is that European governments are particularly insistent on accelerating returns to countries such as Syria or Afghanistan, which is something we find particularly outrageous given the human rights situation in both countries. But that's just to give one example.
Yeah, so in the case of Afghanistan, is there fear that those who are forced to return face persecution by the Taliban regime?
Exactly. Afghanistan is a particularly worrying example for us at the moment, because just in the last few weeks, the European Commission has issued an invitation to Taliban authorities to come to Brussels to accelerate discussions on readmission and deportations of Afghan nationals to the country. This is something that we found outrageous because Afghanistan cannot in any way be considered safe for returns. This is something that many United Nations bodies have said as well, that any returns to the country will put lives at risk. And what we see in the country is an institutionalized system of repression that affects every aspect of daily life. There's restrictions on the right of women and girls. There's a use of torture and other ill treatment. There's enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial executions. Our position is that anybody returned to Afghanistan would be at risk of persecution, and that therefore any engagement with authorities is ignoring the EU's own legal obligations to make sure that people are not sent to places where their lives would be at risk.
Now, was this idea, do you think, possibly inspired by Australia's offshore detention centres for asylum seekers?
It's a very relevant example. It's interesting because in the EU, people talk about these schemes, return hubs, offshore deportation centers, as they term it innovative solutions. Actually, there's nothing very innovative about them. They're tried and tested schemes that have resulted, in our view, in a very systematic and predictable pattern of human rights violations whenever they have been implemented. We have seen a lot of human rights violations resulting from Australia's offshore detention policy. We have seen similar human rights violations resulting from the US third country deportations that the Trump administration is carrying out at the moment. And we saw similar patterns resulting from the UK's attempt to return people or to send people to Rwanda that had no link to the country. So indeed, there's a lot of inspiration of worst practices happening between one state and another. And I think it's important, on one hand, that European governments pay attention to everything that has gone wrong in the past, both in terms of the tremendous human cost, but also a huge practical cost, a huge financial operational cost. These schemes have been mired in judicial scrutiny and have spent years being challenged in the courts, and they have not done great things for the diplomatic standing and the reputation of the countries that were involved in these schemes. And I think it's also important to look at the EU's existing engagement with third countries on migration. Countries like Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, or Turkey that receive a great deal of EU funds and support on migration management to prevent people from leaving those countries. We already see human rights violations there. We already see a failure to guarantee that human rights are being respected. So we believe that those same risks are very likely to happen if we take the step of return hubs as well.
Yeah. And also critics of this policy say, they're not looking at the push factors of why migrants come to EU countries, political persecution, poverty and conflict. But what then can host countries do to change that? If you take Afghanistan as an example, there's, even the might of the US military was not able to handle or take down a Taliban regime.
It's a complicated question, and the response has to be a multifaceted whole of government one. You can't only look at these issues from a migration perspective. You need to look at foreign policy, making sure that human rights is at the center of the EU's engagement with other countries, or any government's engagement with other countries. One key element that we always advocate is you need to ensure that you are providing safe, regular pathways for people to access safety. There will always be people in need of persecution. There will always be people looking for a better life, whether fleeing conflict, fleeing persecution, simply looking for employment or educational opportunities elsewhere. You need to provide safe avenues for people to take those routes if you want them to avoid having to take more dangerous and complicated ones. And I think your point is a really important one. The recent EU changes and reforms to asylum rules are making it ever harder for people to access protection. They will make it easier for people to have their asylum claims rejected, even if previously they would have been receiving refugee status. Even if they should be getting that refugee status, it's far more likely they will be rejected now. And once they're rejected, it's far more likely that they will face arbitrary detention, that they will face various forms of refoulement and being sent to places where their lives will be in danger, that they will be in situations of limbo, that they will be in situations of far more precarity, all the while people's reasons for fleeing stay the same. So this will never be a sustainable migration policy.
Okay, Olivia Sundberg Diez from Amnesty International, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for having me.